Good morning. I'm Reverend Mike Capron, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Troy, Pennsylvania. Our text for this morning is just two verses from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. My dialogue partner for this morning in this series of new sermons from old books is Elton Trueblood. He wrote this book, Alternative to Futility, in 1948. It was an interesting era. World War II was over, but still fresh in everyone's minds. The United States was the preeminent world power, the only nuclear power, and a lot of the rest of the world was still in rubble. The Cold War with the Soviet Union had sprouted, but was not in full bloom yet. I'll be mostly drawing from chapter 1 today, Trueblood's analysis of the era. He said something that shocked me. Great numbers of people in Britain say that they look back to 1940 to 1941 with nostalgia. Those were the days in which they really lived. There was the constant danger of invasion and all the resultant horror. There was the bombing, but there was more. People stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a common pride. They were sustained by great rhetoric and great deeds. Life had significance. Now, all is different. Now there is no danger, but only a constant round of petty restrictions. Life has become commonplace and humdrum. They go back and forth to their places of employment, beget children, and try to pay their bills, but they do not feel that all these details are steps towards some great and dignifying end. Even dull work, whether manual or clerical, that is intrinsically repetitive and mechanical could be ennobling if it were seen as part of something larger. But this is precisely what we have lost. This is Trueblood's thesis that the world of 1948 was suffering from a lack of meaning and higher purpose. And when such things are lacking, we turn to worldly substitutes. A bit later, he continues. Remember, he's talking about 1948. Lacking the joy which comes from meaning and purpose, we turn to all kinds of wretched substitutes. Thus, we cultivate the sensual arts to an absurd and revolting degree. A reasonably accurate index of our level of decadence is provided by the ubiquitous advertisements of whiskey, with their emphasis on delicate shades of flavor, and by the fantastically expensive advertisements of perfume. It would appear that even sexual enjoyment is in need of some encouragement. And then there is gambling. The likelihood is that there is more betting now than at any other time in history. That was 1948. 76 years later, we have some parallel situations. I'm going to name some products and pastimes. I'm not disrespecting people who use these products or engage in these activities, but I do think there's a pattern here. Let's start with gambling. In 2024, sports gambling is now legal in 40 states and counting. That includes both New York and Pennsylvania, by the way. Trueblood also noted whiskey ads in 1948. Full disclosure, I never gamble, but I like a good whiskey now and again. But in 2024, alcohol-related deaths are up. Deaths from drugs like fentanyl are way up. Marijuana is now legal in 22 states. That includes New York, but not Pennsylvania, by the way. There are some good reasons for legalization and some good reasons against it. My point is not to get into a debate about these particular issues, but we should notice that such things are very popular and that they prey on human weakness. I'm not too worried about a bet between friends about a local game, but I'm certain that the gambling industry, like other industries, is more than happy to help us get in over our heads. And how concerned or celebratory are the purveyors of these products when people become addicted to them. Now, some of you may be thinking, what's the problem? It's a free country. Well, yes, it is. And we must preserve that freedom. And yet I'm also reminded of a conversation from Genesis 4. Cain has just murdered his brother Abel and hidden the body. God asks Cain, "Where is Abel?" Cain shrugs and says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the real answer is, no, you are your brother's brother. A big part of Jesus' message is a call to treat strangers and even enemies like they were members of your immediate family. I'm flashing back to an incident from my 20s. I was the last one in the church parking lot after some meeting. These two people on bicycles rode up and explained that they were from Brazil and were biking from Canada back home. Their English was a little broken, but they showed me some photocopies of a newspaper article about their journey. They were looking for a place to sleep that night. I was a young single guy, an engineer, and I didn't know what to do. Like, what's the protocol for this kind of thing? So I called my pastor, David. He said, "Well, Mike, what could you do?" I said, "Well, I have a guest room." He said, "That's a good idea." So they came to my house. We talked a little more, but they were clearly exhausted and went to bed early. I fed them breakfast and they pedaled off. I often think about that story when I recall Jesus sending out his disciples 2 by 2 and cautioning them not to take any extra supplies. They were to be completely reliant on the hospitality of strangers. I think True Blood's analysis is brilliant. The people he was looking at lacked a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and so do we. But what he doesn't say explicitly is that to have meaning, we also need to have connection and community. And by that measure, we in the United States, and maybe in the whole world of 2024, are in far worse shape than the people of 1948. I was listening to a talk by David Brooks, and he emphasized how isolated we've all become from each other. He ticked off a list. We've gotten a lot sadder as a society, rising suicide rates, rising mental health problems. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends is up by 4-fold since 2000. The number of teenagers who say they are persistently hopeless and despondent is 45%. The number of people not in a romantic relationship is up by 1/3. 2/3 of Americans used to give to charity. Now fewer than half of us do. The sad truth is that we have become sadder and meaner in the fabric of our society. We've also gotten a lot more pessimistic. Some of that is the media's fault. The number of headlines that generate fear and anger is up by about 200% over the last 15 years. My friends, hey, this is not a formula for a happy, stable, and moral society. It is not the formula for a unified society where people love and trust each other. It is a formula for a fragmented society of untrusting, sad, and often angry individuals. And of course, this is reflected in our politics. Again, I'm quoting from Brooks here. In a healthy society, we have what you call the politics of redistribution. We have big arguments, but the arguments are about how high taxes should be or where spending should go. We don't really have that kind of politics anymore. Instead, we have the politics of recognition or identity. People are going into politics in an attempt to make themselves feel better and to make the other side feel ashamed. People who call themselves lonely are 7 times more likely than others to be active in politics. So there's a lot of lonely people dominating our political activism. Many are attempting to use politics to fill a hole in their own soul, to be affirmed, and to get retribution on people they dislike. This kind of politics gives you the illusion that there's a war of good and evil and that you're on the side of good. Both Team Red and Team Blue fall prey to this. It results in a delusional feeling of righteousness that doesn't really expect much from you. Just sit in front of the newspaper or TV station or social media feed of your choice and feel indignant, angry, and outraged. Political parties don't expect you to sit with a widow or feed the poor. They just want you to keep your eyeballs glued to their messaging and to vote for their party in November. Again, this is not a formula for a healthy society, and it is not a formula for a good Christian life. Jesus met people where they were. He almost never complained or judged harshly. He showed love and compassion. And then he invited people to follow him in deeper ways. In 2024, we are seeing everything that True Blood saw in 1948, but amplified many times over. In particular, the crisis of loneliness, isolation, and hopelessness is much worse. True Blood had a prescription for his era, and I think we need the same medicine. It involves going back into our Christian roots and doing what the early church did. True Blood wants us to remember the way Christian community was formed and emphasize doing that as part of our life together as a community, and then letting it spread from there. He states the central problem is not political, but moral and spiritual. What we seek is a situation in which the rank and file of our people are filled with a vibrant faith. If they could believe greatly in something, if they could see some purpose to give them a reason for striving, life might become more radiant than we can now imagine. And then in spite of the rubble and lack of housing, people could live joyously and victoriously. Once long ago, there was such a faith, and it swept the ancient world with remarkable speed. It began in such a modest manner, in such an out-of-the-way place that the unbiased observer at the beginning would have considered any suggestion of its success a fantastic proposition. There were a few unlettered men in an obscure province, and their movement was obviously a failure, for their leader, Jesus, had been executed. And yet something so remarkable happened that within a generation, these people and others like them had began to make a difference in the entire known world. If we ask how this most remarkable of miracles of history was performed, we are amazed by the simplicity of the method. The world needed a saving faith, and the formula was that such a faith comes by a particular kind of fellowship. Jesus did not form an army, establish a headquarters, or even write a book. All he did was collect a few unpromising people, inspire them with a sense of his vocation and theirs, and build their lives into intensive work of affection, worship, and work. Above everything that Jesus said or did, this stands as his supreme achievement, that he formed an organic community to carry forward in history, the revelation of God, which had been made in Israel. One of the truly shocking passages of the gospel is that in which Jesus indicates that there is absolutely no substitute for the tiny redemptive society. If this fails, he suggests, all is failure. There is no other way. The Sermon on the Mount is largely directed to making his little band understand this momentous fact and to prepare for the subsequent burden by adequate discipline. Here, the key passage is the metaphor of salt. He told the little bedraggled fellowship that they were actually the salt of the earth, and that if this salt should fail, there would be no adequate preservative at all. He was staking all on one throw, and it succeeded wildly. I believe in churches as communities of love, and I think the bond of love we share in Christ should make this a safe space to speak to one another. Because when I see a member of Team Red or Team Blue, I don't see an enemy. I see a beloved child of God with a unique story which I'm curious about. I also love True Blood's emphasis on us as the salt of the earth. I looked up in a cooking article what salt does to recipes. Two of the chief things listed were that it removes bitterness and increases sweetness. So if we are the salt of the earth, that is part of our calling. Remove bitterness. Don't add to it. On the contrary, increase sweetness. To do that, we don't only need a sense of connection with God. We do need that above all else. But we need something else too. Connection with people around us. We live in a time when that is in short supply. We need to rekindle a strong sense of community. I don't think it is that hard. We are social creatures. David Brooks told a story about a presentation he did with a social psychologist. In the middle of the event, the psychologist halts what is going on and proposes an exercise. I'm going to make everybody in this room find a stranger, and for the next 10 minutes, tell them about the last time you cried. And David heard a groan go up from the room. The psychologist said, how many of you want to do this? Only a few hands went up. How many of you don't want to do it? 80% of the hands went up. Well, he made them do it anyway. And they did it. And 10 minutes pass. And they can't get them to shut up and come back to the presentation. Finally, when they do come back, the psychologist asked, how many of you enjoyed that? And 80% of the hands went up. There is something within us that hungers for real human connection. For so many people in our society, they are starving for it. Listen, my friends, early Christians were thrilled as they thought of themselves as part of this emerging divine purpose. They had a link with eternity because in their fellowship, they were partners in the creative love that had made the world. And they kept talking to people. They welcomed new people into the community. Their group did not have rigid boundaries. It was enormously porous. Joining was easy. At first, hurting people just found a balm for their souls and smiling faces who welcomed them. And then later, they came to understand some of the doctrines of the faith and to adopt disciplined spiritual practices. I would love for us to be a porous community like that. You folks in Troy or wherever you live, you know your area far better than I do. Who are the hurting, lonely, isolated, embittered people who need to join a community of love? We're going to read the Beatitudes. I recently heard an interesting take on this introduction to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Wherever you find people with these qualities, you also find fellowship with Jesus. Since we're online, I'm going to read this for you in Matthew 5, 1 through 11. And this will be my conclusion. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure at heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil falsely on my account, says Jesus. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Those are the people we need to be looking for, right? Who do we know that's poor in spirit, mourning, meek, hunger and thirsting for righteousness, merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, and all the rest? Let's welcome them to our communities. Remember, they're people like us, beloved children of God. That's my message for today. May God bless you all. Amen.